We ended the last module by looking at this first candidate view about the nature of perceptual knowledge. This view that to perceive something is sufficient to know it, that you are the arbiter of the category, the concept, the class that you apply to perception. You're never going to get it wrong. And we noticed that Plato just piled on objections, made it seem like it's completely ridiculous. And I think there's an important point for this. On the one hand, there's this general point that he wants to reject the doctrine of an eternal flux, which in his mind, he explicitly says this, is a source of epistemic relativism, but I think he also views it as a source of skepticism. But he also has positive points that he wants to make. He wants to use this as a mechanism for arguing that, yes, sensory experience is full of flux. It sometimes seems to contradict itself, to change over time, and so on. But there is a constancy through this flux. There is something that remains the same underneath the superficial changes. And this is what you get to, what you come to know when you know about the world. In order to do that, you've got to realize that perception alone proves insufficient for knowledge. To perceive isn't sufficient to know. And instead, he's going to offer up a view about the nature of perception. Perceptual knowledge is the product of sense perception, our experiences, and judgment or thought. So it is our judgments about experiences that give rise or fail to give rise to perceptual knowledge. So it's through thought, not merely sensation, that we get at the nature of objects, i.e., what makes them what they are throughout the changes in their sensory properties. And it's at this point that you enter into the dialogue. Now, Plato sort of articulates a view about perception that I'm going to give you a cartoon version of to illustrate it, and that'll be the final part of this first lecture on the Theaetetus. So, when we have knowledge of some kind of class or category or individual, we have a knowledge of the form of that thing, its essential properties, what makes it the thing that it is. So, for example, we might have the form of cat. What is catness? Qua cat. When a cat comes along, like Bill the cat here, that cat is a cat in virtue of its participating in this form, of it having this essential nature. But the objects of the sensory realm are imperfect. They don't have that form in its real perfect form. They are defective. So when we have sensory experiences of those objects in the sensory realm, that sense experience isn't sufficient for us to know what they are. Instead, it's by our matching of perception with our knowledge of the nature of objects, classes, categories, individuals, that judgment about the perception based on our knowledge of categories, that's what gives rise to perceptual knowledge. That is, our ability to correctly categorize something as a cat, whether it's orange or black or calico or so on. And this is an important aspect of the dialogue, because Plato starts to talk about the nature of the world and how we experience it, and he starts to talk about models of how our mind and the world interact, and use those to think about how it is that we can come to know something, or conversely, to fail to know something. So that interaction is something that you don't often hear spoken about when you talk about people like Plato or Descartes. But I want to emphasize that thinking about knowledge, even with rationalists like Plato and Descartes, it's grounded in an understanding, an ontology about the way the world is, and a theory about our mind and how our mind interacts with the world. And this is certainly true for Plato.